Welcome to another Gamma Partner Artist Feature interview. Today we speak with Violet Bond. We speak on all things Aboriginal art, Australiana, making people feel uncomfortable, video, photography, glitch, and her scanner. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. Okay, very excited to have Violet Bond with us today. Violet is a fellow Aussie. She's a Gamma Partner artist. I was super pleased to have met her in Miami last year. We'd been connected before. I really love her work. She does really interesting things with photography. We're going to unpack her story, but enough from me. Violet, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, where you started, how you got to this point. You can go all the way back to when you were a kid and you're like, I like creating things, but yeah, go for it. And welcome again.
Thank you. A lot of people in the space have known me predominantly for my performance work. And I came into the space very early 2022, was exploring the space in late 2021. But a very random series of events led me to NFTs. I was making ceramics in my backyard at the time out of wild clay. And my neighbour in Arnhem Land in outback Northern Australia was actually a ceramicist, and I was having some pots explode in the kiln over the back fence. And we started having this conversation, and we were having a beer, and over time we got to know each other, and she said, she was working in NFTs. And I kept calling them EFTs, and I was like, I don't understand. Why would somebody, I don't get it. And then over time, we had this ongoing discussion, and Sarana Hayata, she's a Kiwi Maori Australian artist, very well known for doing the artwork around Meta Angels 2022. And we just kind of got chatting, and she really opened this door for me about understanding that a digital file would mean that you could own something. And as somebody who had struggled with video and what it meant to own a video and the complications around that. I mean, when you're a photographer, you can print something, you sign it, somebody owns it. But how does somebody own a picture? And when I was about 16, I was in an art gallery in Melbourne, and there was a guy who was selling this loop of grey birds flying through the sky. And he was selling them on CD, a limited edition of 10 CDs. And I remember at the time thinking it was the dumbest thing, because I was like, what if they get scratched? What does that ownership mean? Do you sell them on the secondary market? What happens? Like, are you actually buying the hardware, or are you buying the actual artwork? Can you get a copy of the artwork? Does that mean the edition size stays the same? Like, it was all of these really clunky kind of imagined solutions to what it was to own a video work. And then meeting Sarana and having her kind of explain what blockchain was, and this exchange of the original code in a way that meant that the duplication was impossible, was really what sunk me in hard. And got into exploring things, made some really fundamental mistakes, like minting 50 photos of ceramic pots on OpenSea. And of course, none of them sold bar one, I think. And, like making some really, just ill-informed learning processes. But then I found Tez, and the Tez community was very underground. It was very traditionally artistically focused, away from PFPs at the time. And that was really a doorway for me. I made my first performance work, which was a video work on Tez. And my work is quite controversial. It involved a lot of nudity, a lot of skulls, bones, death, decay. And so I needed a place that was going to embrace that. And at the time, Ethereum was very PFP focused, and I just didn't really feel like I had a home. And sort of Tez became the place that were like, yeah, we can see skulls and bones and centipedes and snakes and Australiana. We get that. That's okay. We can absorb that information. And also Tezos being based in France meant that there was this French understanding of the female body, what it was to push boundaries, what it was to be revolutionary. And so that was very easy. And then over time, what happens is, it sounds like a kind of foregone pathway, that eventually all roads lead to the mother chain, because what started happening was I started to see IPFS artworks disappear that were on chain. And that, as someone who worked in traditional art for a long time and watched Indigenous artists have paintings float down rivers and their art collections burn down in buildings, which was real for us, eaten away by termites, like stuff that really affected artworks. It became this like, well, what happens if somebody doesn't pay the IPFS? Like we're looking at that with foundation now, people losing the imagery. And that really, like, that's how all roads lead to Bitcoin eventually. And so I started exploring what that meant, which led me to Gamma, and other people referring me to Gamma like Zoe, and other people that were really interested in this like natural immutability and where it ends up. And so that's basically the very long, short-winded version of, how I ended up with Gamma.
Yeah, well, we're lucky that you did end up with us, and it is the long, short version. You touched on a few really interesting things. So you mentioned before this space, the digital scene, so to speak, you were involved in the traditional art, the art space, and you also mentioned about Aboriginal art and that there's this ephemeral nature to us. Do you want to talk to us about, what did you do and how was that experience and how did that perhaps shape what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I worked as an arts business manager, basically finding markets to expose or to sell remote Indigenous artists into. So, very remote communities, English is a second, third, fourth, or fifth language, making incredible artworks, but then don't have the language skills or business just skills available in the surrounding environment to actually get those artworks out into the world and create opportunities, financial opportunities for people. So that was my job. My job was to take an artwork and find it a home. And I did that all throughout remote communities with Indigenous people in Northern Australia for about 12 years. And I loved that job. It was really a way for me to, work with people that I really, really cared about, and then be in this service position of working for people. It wasn't about me. It was never about me. It was about my job is about creating opportunities for others. And so that was basically my full-time career. And then I had 2 sons and took some time out. But I'd always loved making art. It was just thought it was always adjacent to my career. I'd loved photography. I'd made ceramics. I'd done a lot of that work, but it was just adjacent to my career.
Yeah, how interesting. And obviously working in these remote areas and really getting to know Australia, that's the cultural heart of Australia, right now, at least. Not thousands of years ago, obviously it was more widespread. Sadly, that's how it is now. But yeah, how did that impact you in terms of the way you create? You mentioned you use a lot of Australiana, skulls, various flora and fauna, and the human form as well, which we do see in Aboriginal art. It seems like it's impacted at least the way in which you create, or maybe it's in there conceptually somewhere.
Yeah, I think that I have been very intentional because obviously I'm a cis white woman working in a colonized country. So I'm always very clear on the fact that I am not Aboriginal. I don't have Aboriginal heritage. I'm not in any way representative of that community. I had the very great privilege of growing up as a child with Aboriginal Australians. My brother married an Aboriginal woman. They have 6 gorgeous Indigenous kids. And so even though those, Indigenous roots are within my family, that's not directly my story. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I have been very conscious of in my practice is to talk about wilderness and proximity to wildness, and the importance of, I think, Western culture understanding the value of wilderness without people and the value of wilderness just being what it is. Because I think in a lot of Western culture, we think, okay, well, we have this wilderness. What do we do with it? We have this wilderness. How do we capitalize on it? How do we turn it into tourism or housing or whatever? And I think the Indigenous perspective of the world leans towards wilderness has value just in the existence and the power of what it is. And so a lot of my practice is about we cannot protect what we do not understand and what we are not connected to. And so a lot of the immersions that I do in bones or dirt or skulls are partly about making people feel uncomfortable because it's like, well, why does dirt make you uncomfortable? You know, what is it about being in Western society that makes, why dirt? Why is that a problem? And you'd be surprised, of all the works that I do with, you know, snakes and skeletons, dirt is up there with the things that people dislike the most. And so it's also like, it's challenging an audience to say, what have we become disconnected from? Why are wild animals scary? Is it because we don't know that a snake is venomous or non-venomous? Have we lost that knowledge? Is it because we don't see death as part of life anymore, so we want to stay away from that? And so those questions around proximity to wildness are probably where I've taken my practice, as opposed to ever trying to speak for Indigenous Australians who have obviously a very different perspective and experience, personal experience to me.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. We'll touch on the wilderness aspect in my follow-up question, but I am curious, and you know, you mentioned about, and you touched on IPFS and how we're already seeing broken links and there's not that permanence, and then bringing art to Bitcoin, which we will obviously talk about later on, creates that permanence. It creates that endurance, that longevity of the art. Obviously, nothing is ever permanent. That's just the way of the world. We never know. But on the scale of permanence, it's right over there.
Mm-hmm.
That is really fascinating, I think, from a cultural perspective, seeing not just with Aboriginal art, but all physical art, and how a house could burn down and you can lose your photos, you know, you can lose artwork you've been working on. To have that peace of mind that the art will endure, but then also potentially because of who you have worked with and the preservation of culture. I think obviously living in Australia, not in the Northern Territory and being as close to it as yourself, but having like a serious appreciation for that.
Yeah, so I mean, the permanence impermanence thing is really palpable. I mean, not only did I work in art centres in remote places where, you know, Australia is an unpredictable place, but I also worked in art centres that specialise in natural materials. So we had situations where this tiny little bug called a borer would actually eat away at the artwork, and occasionally you would just turn around and an artwork would be disintegrating. And so it was, not only did I work in this place, which is about ephemera and ephemeral, you know, themes in the work itself, but the work itself became ephemeral. And so we were constantly doing this battle with, you know, fumigating bugs and keeping things in freezers and shipping things to Tasmania and trying to find ways to stabilize the artwork itself. But we never changed the work. It was often on bark. It was often using natural materials, because what you got, and we used to say this to people a lot, is like, what you got when you bought that painting was a tree. You got the bark, you got the plant, you got the thing, you got the rocks, you got the paint. So what you ended up with was this really tangible piece of an environment. And that always fascinated me, that you can, you know, you can embody these natural materials and you can give people a feeling of a place that they'd never been to. And so that was the thread for video for me. Like, I started doing photography, always loved photography. And of course, a still image can give you that. But, you know, one of my best known pieces was a fire queen piece. And in that, people are viscerally either pissed off, deeply concerned, you know, think I'm crazy. And like, here's a chick on a screen on the other side of the world. And you feel so passionately, viscerally about this artwork that you feel invested in that person's safety through a screen. And I thought the power of that in performance was kind of amazing. And so the interesting part with Bitcoin, of course, is then video is almost impossible for now, because it's obviously, you know, you're talking gigabytes of files and blah, blah, blah. So how do you bring the digitally interesting part of ephemera and performance to a space that has, you know, gigabit, you know, sacrifices and play? And that was always a real interesting challenge for me. Like, how do the constraints of the chain itself inform the artwork in the same way that the bark painting itself informed how we treated it, you know? So here you are with the material itself actually informing how the artwork exists in the world. And I sort of loved even though it doesn't seem like there's a lot of similarity in those two things, it's there, you know, it's a touch point that the influence of the creative practice is in the work itself. And as someone who works in natural materials,
that seems really obvious to me. It may not seem obvious to everyone, but for me, it was really closely linked.
For sure, I agree. And I think that, yeah, the cohesion or the confluence of both those things there are very powerful. Before we have a look at some of your work and we can elaborate on that, where did the performative or the performance aspect come from you? Were you always a performer? Was it something that evolved as you became a creator in this space? And then on top of that, yeah, talk a little bit more about perhaps how the Australiana, that, you know, that natural, like using dirt, using bones, using animals, snakes, you know, how did that all weave in too?
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm not a natural performer. I mean, I love to tell a story. And I think when you grow up around people that are natural storytellers, which Indigenous people are natural storytellers, but also Australians are natural storytellers. Like, I just came back from a bush camp with a bunch of cowboys, and goddamn, like, those guys love to tell a good yarn, you know? So I think that there is this element of, we communicate with each other by spinning an entertaining story. And my father was the first one to not let facts get in the way of a brilliant tale, you know. So I understood from a very young age the difference between a factual account that had importance and, you know, archival importance, and the ability to entertain through telling a story, the ability to beguile people with the wild and what that was. Like, I knew that from a very, very young age. And so I think that was very much part of it. But no, to the performance, I absolutely had no intention of ever being a performance artist. I went out in Arnhem Land, where we lived, with my camera to take some photos of a horse that had died. And it had a perfect skeleton. It had just basically laid down and died in the drought. And so I wanted to go take photos of this skeleton. And when I was there, I was standing there actually with my father-in-law and my sister-in-law. And I stood in front of this skeleton, and the rib cage was like perfectly around. And I was like, I think I have to get into this horse skeleton. It was a really palpable moment of inspiration where I was like, it's kind of me shaped. And it was a really weird thing to kind of explain. But my sister-in-law now has known me for 12 years. And so she was like, all right, looks like she's taking her clothes off to get into a horse skeleton. And so I just said to her, here's my phone, just film me getting into this horse skeleton and getting out again. And I said to my father-in-law, just walk down the road with my boys, just walk down that way. And that's what we did. We created this 17-second, very short little piece of me just crawling into the womb or the belly of this horse skeleton and crawling out. And that was my first performance work. But in the viewing of it, what I realized is that performance works don't have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They can be like a photo in that you can have a fragment, and that's fine. You don't have to actually wrap up a whole story. You can be like, this is basically a photo that moves, you know, Harry Potter style, and that's okay. As opposed to, like, I'm not a movie maker. A lot of people have said, you know, do you expect on doing anything larger format? No, I don't. I don't have any intention. I'm not a cinematographer. I don't do movie making. I don't ever want to be a director. I don't care about narrative in that way. I want people to feel like I was in the bush and you were in the bush and you watched someone on stage for a few seconds and that was it. It's a single thing, or a person in a museum for a moment. There's never any intention of beginning, middle, and resolution. It's not that. It's, you're seeing a painting that's moving. So you get a fragment. It's a painting that moves. That's it. It's a single moment. And I think most of my work is pretty clear in that style. There's like, it's a moment, captured a moment. And I think the photographer in me really pulls me back to that, because that's what photographers do all the time. You know, they capture only a moment. And so when you're doing performance as a photographer, it's much easier to say, I'm going to do 17 seconds of a moving picture than I'm, you know, going to go and become a director. So I think that that's how that kind of played out.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's like a moving moment. People can draw out whatever narrative they want from it, even if, like you said, there is some sense of maybe what you were trying to achieve. How do you find that balance of having a purpose for the creation of a particular performance, but then also leaving it for the viewer, or knowing that there's room for the viewer to create their own meaning as well?
Look, usually I have been very strict, and this came from making ceramics. I was very strict about never having any intention. What happens to me when I get into the planning is I make bad work. That's usually what happens. I say, oh, I'm going to plan and plan and plan. And then the thing's boring as shit. That's usually how that happens. So alternatively, my response has been spend time in the environments that inspire you and wait for Lady Inspiration to turn up. That's basically been my ethos. And to this point, like once it's kind of a privilege and a curse to be an artist. And I know photographers talk about this a lot. It's always about the missed shot. You'll be driving somewhere down the road and you see a flight of geese over the perfect cloud. And you're like, God, I missed the shot, and so you spend your life being inspired by these moments and watching them disappear. So I've never been in a situation where I was in a really interesting, wild environment and I didn't find a tree trunk really fascinating, or a riverbank super interesting, or, mud on the side of the road, beautifully colored. Like, I think that that's just having artist's eyes. But that's been my practice. I've tried very hard to also not listen to crypto too much and to not end up in a place where you feel you have an audience for a certain type of work, and therefore you continue to make that work because that's what your audience knows you for. We find that a lot on Instagram. That becomes very tricky because you get known for something, people are passionate about what you do. And actually, when I moved away from ceramics and moved back to photography and performance, I had a lot of hate mail. I had a lot of people that were really pissed off about that. They had followed me for my ceramics content. They were very passionate about my ceramics content. And they essentially left my audience because they were like, this is not what I'm here for. And it was a good lesson because it was just like, look, artists find inspiration in what they find inspiration in. You just got to go down the road. I mean, even just yesterday, like there were all these opportunities to make photos in the bush. And I was like, I just kind of want to get back to my scanner. And it was this really interesting thing where it's like, yes, that's work I could make. I could get out of the car right now and I could go and make that work. But I'm having such an interesting conversation with this scanner, which is part of the Gamma project, that all of my inspiration is there. And when it comes to wild animals, the problem with when you work with wild animals and bones, people give you wild animals and bones. That's what happens. And so a girlfriend of mine found a dead snake in her yard, beautiful, silvery, gorgeous snake, and called me and was just like, hey, we've just found this snake. I know you might want it for your scanner. Do you want to come and grab it? Which I did, and put him on the scanner. And he's just beautiful, like pearlescent rainbow gorgeousness. And so that's what happens is like the world kind of, an artistic friend of mine often talks about her inspiration when she's online, like the universe kind of goes, oh, look, creative person's online. Let's give them lots of inspiration. And so I think that that's really what happens for me. I try and go with the inspiration without trying to prescribe it too much. Because as soon as it's a fine line, I mean, you can make bad art too when it's prescribed, but it's, I try and just go with the inspiration and judge it later. So go with the inspiration. It might be shit, but look at it after the fact. Don't look at the inspiration as being kind of stupid. There's never been a time that I've made art and I've regretted making the art. There's been times where I have said, this isn't up to scratch, but that's not the same thing.
Yeah, we'll pull up the work soon because you just mentioned the scanner, but that last comment meant that I had to ask a question first. How do you feel, like you said, looking at your own work and deciding if it is up to scratch or not up to scratch? How do you come to that decision? And then also, how do you feel when you watch a video, let's just say of yourself getting inside of that horse, but how, when you're performing, I suppose you're the performer, you're the actor at that point in time, but then reviewing it later, yeah, how do you decide that you love it, you want to put it out to the world, but also how do you feel looking at yourself in the shot, in the act?
Yeah, I mean, well, usually I can tell whether work is good or not about how far it went. So if there was any pain involved, if I was eaten alive by anything, if I was dehydrated, sunburnt, afflicted, covered in a rash, or any kind of physical pain, I know that work probably went far enough. If none of that was involved and it was very comfortable, probably not great art. So that's usually my line. And I usually reflect on the artwork in that way. I can usually see in a piece whether it looks uncomfortable in its beauty. Is it confronting? Would someone stop when they were walking past a shop window in our busy lives, would someone stop and go, you know, what the hell is that thing? You know, one of my pieces, it's in reverse, which I love to do because it looks creepy. But one of my pieces was a whole bunch of buffalo bones that link together around my body. And for a long time, people didn't realize that it was in reverse. And so it was just me coming out of the bones. And so there was all these conversations about why the hell is she going into that sand monster? It's going to eat her. What the hell is she doing? And so those reactions from people where they're concerned for my safety, generally pretty uncomfortable, but confront something in the conversation, death, dirt, life and death, mortality, that is usually when I'm like, this confronts a question. If it was a pretty girl in a bikini in a pretty flower field, okay, that's a pretty picture, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't confront anything in our kind of very materialistic world. So, and I'm usually quite confrontational. I do things like I always make sure I've got, you know, a lot of body hair. I always make sure that everything is a bit ugly. Like I never want my pieces to be objectified in this sexual way. And very early on, Nihilus, most people know him online, beautiful black and white photographer, with the skeleton piece, when I was coming out, this guy was like, oh, you know, boobs, blah, blah, blah. And he just was like, if you missed the rib cage and were distracted by the boobs, there's something wrong with you. And it was this really beautiful point. It was just like, in this moment, if you can't see the mortality and the human form in this storytelling way, then my work's probably not for you. And so that's really been what it is. There's always a sense of the uncomfortable. I mean, I don't know how well you can see it, but this piece behind me, just here, is like lots of my body, many, many bodies. And a lot of people are like, are you dead in all of those? And I was like, well, no, but it is meant to look like that because it's about these trees that were cut down. And so it's all about death. But people are like, yes, but the landscape's beautiful and it looks Australian and it's this rich color palette. So it's like two things. You've got the beauty of the environment and leading people into a world that a lot of people don't know what the Outback Australia looks like, but then coupled with this sense of the uncomfortable. And I think that that's usually the line for me.
Yeah, fascinating. Where do you think call it the desire to portray the uncomfortable to people came from?
Probably from growing up out bush. Like I realized very early on that having a pet snake at a 3-year-old probably wasn't that normal. You know, and I just thought it was, you know, I just didn't know anything different. And so I just think the life that I had, I didn't realize at the time just how close to the wild it was until later. And then I realized how much people are kind of disconnected in their conversations from what the reality of living in the wilderness is. And so I became very passionate about, we protect the world's wilderness and wild places by feeling a connection to it. And so that really became like the center point.
Yeah, fascinating. Oh, I love it. All right. Well, you mentioned the scanner before. So, we'll pull up the broken portraits. It's your collection of one-of-ones.
Yeah.
Some have found some lovely collectors. Here they are. But yeah, tell us about this collection. Tell us about this scanner. Like you said, you were just away. You could have created, but you keep getting drawn back to the scanner in this story. So yeah, go for it. Really explore this for us.
Yeah, look, I mean, I walked into my dad's house. My dad's 82 now, and quite like losing touch with his ability to communicate with technology. And so he was having a really hard time scanning his old slides. And so I said, yeah, well, the reason you're having a really hard time is because your scanner is broken. Like it doesn't work anymore. And so I sort of took it and started playing with it. And I ended up finding that this incredible fracturing was happening. And it was in the fracturing that the one-of-one thing occurred. So if you have a technology and you can do the same thing 1,000 times, that means it's just soulless. It has nothing that thumbprints that thing. Whereas when something breaks, like if a printer leaves a line in a specific spot, it's like, it came from that printer. It's a thumbprint on the technology. And so the unpredictable nature of this scanner kind of became a bit of a compulsion. And I mean, Empress Trash and I talked about Duchamp. with the toilet and, you know, what is art and what is technology. And so something now being broken, does that mean it's more alive? In which case, then you've got references to Rumi, like the cracks in our souls. That's how the light gets in, you know. So there's all this philosophy tied up in what it is to be broken and what it is to die. And so these are all slowly decaying versions of me that will never exist again. And I mean, there's Photoshop elements in there because obviously I have a photography background. So we've used adjustments through Photoshop to really bring out the personalities there. Like the middle piece in the center there, it feels a little bit coldy, that piece actually, because it's got the green and the pink, which is kind of a collage element. But I loved this, like, so that was two scans put together. And so you had this like color scan, which was broken, and then this black and white scan that didn't really work. But when you put them together, you ended up with this collage effect. And then when it was put on Bitcoin, it pixelated. So it's got this whole double thing happening. But again, trying to not go with what's prescribed and accept the kind of craziness of what this scanner does is really interesting for the letting go process, because you put things on the scanner, you think, okay, this is going to look like this. And then it absolutely doesn't look like that. You're just like, okay, this is, I mean, and it sort of reminds me of people that work with AI, right? Because they're talking about the AI. They're like, this is what I want out of the AI. And then the AI gives you 27 fingers and toes and doesn't listen to you at all. And so it's another example of a conversation with technology that's not human. And you're trying to ask it to do human things like create an artwork when it's essentially just not human. So, and then I liked the overlay element of using these natural materials. So we've got, you know, leaves and seeds and snakes and bottle brush and Australian wattle and, you know, fish and a whole bunch of these natural elements that are tied in. And they're all ephemeral, even though now they're on Bitcoin from something that's broken, you know. So it's this poetic layering of life and death in the digital realm, which I keep coming back to it because it feels for me that getting to know this scanner better and better, it's endlessly fascinating and frustrating in its kind of mess.
100%. I love that you use the word poetic because, yeah, so many of the elements there really are poetic about this digital device, but it's physical and it's broken. You're getting that error. You're getting almost that glitch. It's not, you don't know what's going to come out of it. There's parallels with AI, but really also it's almost the counter to AI because you're using these such physical things to create the digital outputs. It's quite fascinating. And yeah, these are one of ones. Tell us about that just as an artist. You know, you're putting these originals, these one of ones, these things that can't be created onto Bitcoin. You're preserving these, we'll call them outputs that this scanner's creating.
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to what it is to take a photograph, right? Like you've captured a moment, the moment's gone, you can never make it again, there's the moment. And sure, you can edition the photograph, but there's something about if you're selling the moment. So it's different if you're selling an artwork, which you're selling a print for a home, that's one thing. But if you're asking someone to invest in a moment, if you're asking someone to invest in an idea, then there's something lovely about the immutability of that. There's something really joyous about the fact that this output happened once and now there's one of it and we move on to the next once, which I thought was really poetic. There will be some additions and we have made some and I'll continue to make some additions. But for this particular part, I just thought the uniqueness of the scan itself meant that the work should also have that sense of it was there and then it's gone and there's no more. And I will say too, the next iteration of this, I know we haven't gone on to the additions part, but the next iteration of this is I've actually, very Mad Max Australiana, but my husband and I have worked out a way where I can take this scanner and I can plug it into a car battery. And so when we go on our next camping trip, we're actually going to take the scanner out with us. And so when I find bones or skeletons or whatever, I'm actually going to scan them in place. And so it's going to be me by the side of the road with an extension cord hooked up to a car battery, taking a broken scanner upside down, trying to capture images in the dirt, which I also think is very performative, even in itself.
I love it.
I mean, Yeah, so the image itself is probably going to be an image of what it is, but the actual idea of me being out in the middle of nowhere with a car battery trying to make this Mad Maxi thing kind of work, which is off grid in itself, I think that's going to be interesting. So I'm going to, yeah, because I just feel like if I'm going to do this capturing well, it also needs to leave my studio, which I think it may work, it may not, who knows.
I love that. Please take video of that or photo. I can just see you in front of the car, the scanners sort of like down on the ground. Like the imagery of that is incredible. I could imagine your house must be full of lots of bits and pieces of tree and bark. And tell me about, the I guess the power of observation and your kids. It must be fascinating for your kids as well. I know on Spaces we've talked about how your kids have sort of interacted with the scan, or at least been with you while you have been.
Yeah, definitely. They're very passionate about the scanner, actually. They will find lots of things now, and they were like, we have to put it on the scanner. Mum, I found you a chicken bone. Will it go on the scanner? Like, it's become a narrative now of like, is it worthy of preserving? Do we want it for the scanner? Almost like it's a pet we have to feed, which is interesting from a 6-year-old, 3-year-old mindset of like, we found a thing. Is it worthy of a gift to the broken technology? You know, which is the way they phrase it. They don't mean it that way necessarily, but it's always a judgment about the value of the thing to the scanner, which I think is, that's an interesting conversation in that too. So yeah.
Well, kids are amazing with personification.
Very. And their insightfulness means that they don't attribute death the same way we do. Like they'll talk about a fire being alive. They'll talk about bark of a tree being alive, a beach being alive, a scanner having needs like new sacrifices. You know, they just see stuffed toys being their friends. Like they have a very different relationship with life and death. And my boys have been involved in my practice quite a lot for 2 reasons. Firstly, that I'm a mum and it would be hard to have a practice without them. Yeah. But the other part is that if you ever had tried to explain to a kid as a ceramicist you were going to go and play with dirt all day and the kids weren't invited, I mean, how? Like what? No. And then I also have 2 little boys, so I'm going to go play with snakes and bugs on a scanner, also not invited. Like that's not a thing. Yeah. So they are part of that. But what they do is they keep me unstructured. So there's been a couple of pieces that they have made, and they have this ability to play with looseness that I really respect. It brings another element of like when I'm getting too controlled or too curated, they'll come in and just like throw 3,000 shells on the scanner and it'll look great because it's very uncontrolled and it mimics nature. So I often find their lack of curatorial control very refreshing.
Yeah, it sounds very reinvigorating. And interestingly, just, you know, what we can see on screen here.
Yeah.
There's naturally the fine art component, but with some of these, there's almost that PFP-ness, which I don't know if it was like intentional, maybe it was. Like you could collect this one of these one-of-ones, and you could wear it as your PFP on the various social media platforms that we use, which I think is a really interesting crossover between, you know, to delineate them like the PFP side and the art side, even though there's so much intersection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually a couple of collectors have. And it's been amazing to see people wearing their broken portraits on Twitter, you know, which has been a new joy for me. But there's 2 reasons for that, I think. One is the fact that the scanner naturally creates this A4 platform, right? And in that, you have these mirrors of the constraints of a PFP project. When you give something the same framing many, 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 many times, that's what that is. It becomes this like a recognizable thing many, 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 many times, but very obviously part of the same project because of the constraint. And part of the reason that I felt so comfortable pushing the color palette and pushing the glitch in these works so far was because I knew the constraint would make them feel cohesive. So it was actually like, had they been all different sizes and, you know, different, you know, formations of that, I actually think I would have had to keep them all black and white or all glitchy or all nature focused. But because of the actual dimensions, it meant the work could go wherever it wanted to go because they just And I knew that there was going to be 99 of them. So I knew that eventually in my mind, I would love to have an exhibition of all 99 of them on a wall, and they together would form an artwork. And when there's many of something with the same constraint, you end up with cohesion. And so, yeah, I think that the constraint gave me more freedom, which is very counterintuitive, but that's what's turned out to be.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And I know some other creators, and you mentioned Empress Trash before, she said the constraints of Bitcoin have actually given her more freedom, or, you know, opened up different aspects of her creativity. So it's funny that you mentioned that. Let's have a look at another collection that you put out, which is, I notice it's based on one of the broken portraits. It's a set of editions called The Eyes Have It.
Yeah.
Which is moving. It's a GIF. It's still available to mint. So for people who are watching, definitely go and check it out. Yeah, this one's really fascinating, and, you know, nice to put out something a little bit different as well, in terms of, like I said, you know, that moving image. It almost links back a little bit to what you have done with some of the moving pieces that we were talking about before.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I loved that this was a play to my previous practice of like performance work alongside still work. And I also loved that, again, thinking about long-term having a solo exhibition. I had a show in France in February last year, and thinking about how to have another conversation with a body of work, because you get so much context when you have work together. And in some ways, I think the NFT space is a little bit plagued by group shows because you only get one work from an artist. And so the joy of being able to see 30 works or 100 works or 200 works is a very different conversation. And so one of the things I wanted to do with this was I wanted to, so this piece is made of about 25 slides where I hand drew eyes on each one of the printer printouts, hand drew with pencil, eyes, and then just time lapse slid them into each other to create a GIF. Pretty standard way of stop motion animation. But again, not trying to be prescribed. When I made this scan, this original scan, I was like, oh, it looks like there's kind of wonky eyes everywhere. And so I just printed one out and made one. And then I thought, oh, I wonder what this would look like if I made some open and shut. And so having GIFs also, which is again, very computer native, but also not printable, even though these are made up of physicals. So, you know, so from an exhibition perspective, I would love to have a large still work where they were all next to each other as a tiled work, and then in a video have the GIF next to them. So again, you have this conversation between the physical world, what's happening in the physical, and then this immutability in the digital, in the motion, and the fact that those conversations can happen. But I love too that video just demolishes, or any moving imagery really demolishes the conversations about, well, I could just print it. It's like, well, you can't print a GIF. So how else are you going to get it, you know? And so it also shatters this like glass ceiling of why buy digital. And that's why I think in this particular case, it was really lovely to be able to go back to something that's very analog, very 1930s, very, you know, Disney Snow White, you know, time lapse kind of, you know, stop motion animation on the most pinnacle of digital fronts, which is Bitcoin. And there's another work in this series, which is the next piece, which has slightly fewer slides, but the same idea. And I also love the fact that you can take a single image, and depending on your drawings, your physical drawings, you can make a completely different artwork based on that time lapse. And so that's really interesting to me. And I loved the idea of editioning this piece because it's made up of editions in the artwork itself. Yeah. So I thought, again, and that's another layer of like the artwork itself is made up of, you know, many, many layers. And so therefore now there are many, many copies in the digital world too. And again, poetic.
Yeah, massively. And yeah, that's an interesting point. I've actually never considered that you know, the ownership of a moving image, of a GIF, that shatters that illusion of, you know, I can just print it out. I love that you said it, because obviously it challenges a lot of people's notion of what it means to own a piece of digital art, coming from the traditional scene, obviously you get it, but you must still be perhaps connected with people from the trad art scene that haven't quite got their head around digital art. And now it being on Bitcoin, I know you and I have spoken about this, it's sort of, they turn their head a little bit, or it does make them ponder a little bit. It's sort of starting to break down barriers. What have you noticed?
Yeah, very much. I mean, we did a show in Miami in December, and we went to Miami Art Week, which is a predominantly traditional part of the week. And I would say every third stall had some digital component. Whether those components were on chain or not, somewhat irrelevant. But in terms of like whether a screen was there with a digital function, whether something was pixelated, whether it was a LiDAR response between you and a digital platform. I just think the integration of digital objects is becoming much easier to stomach. The next step, again, with the geese and the stupid CDs, is to actually like segue those buyers through that education into purchasing in a digital way and understanding digital ownership. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we're not far, you know, we're not far away. And when someone says, oh, right click save, it's like, great, well, you right click save my video then, you know, like, how are you gonna, it's just an interesting, as soon as something is moving, the argument dissipates. And so for me, even though I want to get people back to stills, obviously, because I make stills, it's a way of cracking open a door. It's a way of saying, well, I make video work, you know? So, and people, interestingly, people are prepared to pay for performance works. They're prepared to pay for moving pictures. They're prepared to pay to go to the movies. They want to have an MP4 download. Like, people know what digital ownership is. So once you give people like a segue, it's easier. And I think GIFs have a really unique place in that because they are the computer native of that. They're the crypto native of what video is, really, truly. You know, MP4s and cinema have owned video, but they don't own GIFs. And the nerds own GIFs. And I kind of love that.
I love that too, the nerds own GIFs. It's quite an old file format. And like you said, interesting. You know, you use pencil, you created these sheets of paper. There was that really manual, physical aspect of it as well. So it fits into what you just said.
Yeah, and I had to go to the library to print them, which was even more hilarious. So it was like I had to take my USB stick and go to the library and select black and white and pay my 22 cents. You know, so it felt like very old school, and I couldn't even be bothered trying to communicate that I was then going to put them on Bitcoin. I was like, this is too hard. But it was this moment where it was like, I didn't even have a working printer at the time. So even in its production, it had to get very analog in order to make something digital. And again, that conversation about ephemerality, which is really interesting.
I love that. So if we don't have these conversations, you don't find out those little golden nuggets. And circling right back, it's kind of fascinating. I didn't bring it up earlier. So you lived next door to somebody who happened to be in the NFT scene in, like, for maybe give people a bit of context about where you live, but in Arnhem Land, like, what are the chances?
Like 1,000,000 to 1. Yeah. And the fact that she was a ceramicist. Yeah. And so she only noticed through the back fence that I was blowing up pots because she had previously been a ceramicist. So the segue between two people that lived in Arnhem Land who joined a back fence, who did ceramics, and then who wafted into NFTs, very, very random. It was interesting to me because I probably couldn't have done the immersion without guidance. And that was one of the things with working with Gamma with Bitcoin, was because I am so traditional art brain, and I don't come from a technical place. I often find the technical hurdles difficult until I wrap my head around them. And so having Gamma, having you and the team be able to say, okay, you've come up against a roadblock, here's a suggestion. Or we made a video on this, go and watch a tutorial. Like, that has been as a visual learner who's, you know, in their late 30s, has just been endlessly helpful to me. Like, I can't read code. I'm not going to be one of those people. So having Sarana and really having her like make examples and show me OpenSea and open the door and walk me through it. I don't think it would have happened had she not been able to walk me through it, really. And so, yeah, it was total fluke. I was making ceramics at the time and I was really sick of shipping. I lived in a very remote place. My ceramics I made with local earth and dirt. I fired them in a bonfire. They were likely to breaking and shipping. And I had about a 50% destruction rate in shipping just from where I lived. And so that was really heartbreaking. And so I was looking for another way. And I had already actually started to take videos of my ceramics unfired and putting them in the rain and then videoing them melting into the rain, which was very cool. Again, performative video work. But then I'm like, what the hell do I do with the video? Put it on Instagram? Like what? And so I was making these ephemeral videos at the time and they just didn't have anywhere to go. So when this door was opened with NFTs, I was like, oh, that's the door.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful place to finish up. Violet, thank you so much for your time and really diving into your story and, for us, the ability for us to learn more about that and all those little tidbits and golden nuggets. And like you said, you grew up listening to your dad tell stories. Us Aussies like to tell stories. I think you told a wonderful story. Thanks so much, Violet, for spending time with us today.
Thank you. And again, I just can't thank you guys enough for the effort from the Gamma team, because anyone who's not currently on Bitcoin or exploring the kind of really interesting nuance of this space, I feel like they're missing out on the kind of the period full stop on the end of what NFTs can be if they're not exposed to Bitcoin. Because like we said, it is the mother chain and there is this all roads lead to Bitcoin element. And so artists that are out there who are interested, I can't recommend getting in touch with the Gamma team enough, because it's a space that answers a lot of our questions. And I for one, am really interested to see how the fine art space on Bitcoin develops, because I think it's just the doorways and possibilities are endless.
Completely agree. And yeah, just to add, obviously I'm always there to help, but just for artists, I think even if it's just one piece of work, obviously, it'd be great if it's more, but even if it's just one piece of work and you never even plan to sell it, I think it's so powerful to preserve your legacy on Bitcoin. So I appreciate you trying to reinforce that. And yeah, it's a pleasure to work with you and I can't wait to see what else you release.
Thank you. This has been great. Cheers, Brett.